Hello, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, I'm going to review all of the fiction books that I have read for the first half of 2021. If you watched Monday's video, that was a review of all the nonfiction books that I've read so far this year. I realized that I had way too many books for the first half of the year to put them all into one video, so I decided to split them up. I'm still debating if I'm going to continue it that way going forward, or just do it more frequently, like quarterly, and keep fiction and nonfiction together. So if you didn't watch that video and you didn't get a chance to give your feedback, let me know down in the comments which method you would prefer, and let's get into it. So far this year, I have read 14 fiction books out of the total 25 books that I have read so far this year, right on pace for my goal of 50 books. And instead of just going through them and giving you my star rankings, because let's be real, most of them are 3s and 4s, like 3s and 4 stars, I feel like that doesn't really give you a sense of what I think about it and if I think it's worth reading. So what I'm going to do instead, just like I did with my nonfiction books, is start at the bottom and work my way up and rank them from not worst in comparison to the other books I read. Because some of these books that are at the bottom of the list, I did still enjoy, they just weren't my favorite in comparison to the other fiction books that I read. So let's start with book number 14, which was actually the first Bridgerton book, The Duke and I loved the show. I loved the Bridgerton show. I watched it when I was home over the holidays with my mom and my sister, and it was just like, it was this fun, I mean, we also love Gossip Girl, like we've gone on the Gossip Girl tour together, and so it was this fun, like, Gossip Girl meets this like period piece, and we just enjoyed watching it together, and I loved all the characters and all the music and the outfits, and it was so fun. And so I commented, I actually saw Sam from Happily a Housewife, she posted about reading the first book, and I commented that I wanted to read it, and so she sent it to me, and that was so sweet of her, and I'm glad that I read it, but I didn't immediately want to go read the second one. It is really just a romance novel. Like, it's a small little paperback romance novel. There is very little character development except for the main two characters. They clearly pull in from future books some of that character development of the other characters and other members of her family, which is awesome. And I think like the show is better than the books, I guess, is the end of the story. And I definitely didn't feel compelled. I think I considered for a second borrowing the second one from the library, and then when I saw that the wait list was like a crazy long time, I was like, forget it. I'm just like not even gonna bother. So again, not terrible. I'm glad that I read it, so now I know it's not always like, there are some series that I like and have watched that like, oh, I want to read the book, it's still there on my list. This is not on my list anymore. Okay, this is where the ranking gets a little bit weird because I did read one full series in the first half of the year, a 3-book, a trilogy, like that's what it's called, and I don't have them grouped together. So the 13th book in my rankings is the middle of a series, and the book is called Crossed, and it is a futuristic, like dystopian young adult series. I will talk a little bit more about the series when I get to the first book, which is much higher up on the list, and so we'll get there, but I'm gonna recommend you read that first one and then decide. You might, like me, be a completionist and feel the need to just go ahead and read the entire series, but just know that that middle one is kind of meh and 13th on my list. Book number 12 was Woman in the Window. I think that this was a good classic thriller. Like it had me guessing, it had some twists and turns, and I wanted to keep turning the pages, but it wasn't like the best thriller I've ever read. And so, I like thriller books, but they're not my favorite. It's not like my go-to kind of genre. So I'm glad that I read it. It had been sitting on my shelf for years, and so I finally like read it and then passed the book along, and so I'm glad that I did that. But it just wasn't that great of a book. And then I started to watch the movie on Netflix, and I love Amy Adams, and I could not get into it. And I don't know if that's just because I knew what was gonna happen, like I knew what the plot was, but I just like didn't, I don't know, I didn't enjoy the first half, and I decided it wasn't worth my time, so I actually never even finished the movie. Okay, book number 11 is the third book of that series that I talked about, and that is Reached. Now, I do think that this last book hits differently after the year that we've had. I'm not gonna give away any of the spoilers because I don't wanna ruin it if you do decide to read it, but just know that they go through something similar as to what we have been through. And so that, again, it didn't make it bad, it just made it weird. Okay, books 9 and 10, kind of interchangeable for me here, and those were the Firefly Lane books. So Firefly Lane, and then the second one, which is Fly Away. Same thing here, I watched the series on Netflix, Firefly Lane, and decided to go read the books. Now, this was a scenario where the book was much better. than the show, and I wish I had read the book first, because when you do it the other way around, then the whole time I'm picturing, you know, Katherine Heigl, and I forget the other actress's name from How I Met Your Mother, but I just, like, I kept picturing them instead of letting the characters develop themselves in my mind. But I did really enjoy the book. Like, it is this far down on the list because I think I just read a lot of great fiction this year, but I still do recommend this book. I think it's good. And the sequel, I feel like they're pretty on par, for me anyways. The sequel is very different. Like, it almost is like, is that the same author? Because she writes it in a very different way than the first book. Again, I don't want to give anything away, but it's very interesting the way that she writes the second one. But I loved the character development of the second book, and I enjoyed the storyline. So I definitely do recommend both of these books, even if you have already watched the show on Netflix. And if you haven't, I also recommend that, because I can see how if I'd read the book first, I know there were a lot of people in my comments that were like, I didn't like the show was awful. I can see it. I see that if you read the book and you loved the book, the show did not do as good of a job. I still liked it. I still liked the show. I was still entertained. And so, like, when the second season comes out, I'm still gonna watch it. Why do I feel like every book is being made into a movie or a TV show nowadays? Okay, book number 8 was actually the first fiction book I read this year, and that is The Tattooist of Auschwitz. And this book has been on my list for a long time. This book is highly recommended, highly, like, has lots of accolades, very good. And it's a very good book. It is a tough read. Very tough read. Both Sam and I read it this year, and I think it's important. I think it's an important read, especially if you don't know much about the Holocaust, if you haven't learned a lot. I do feel like I know a good bit about the Holocaust that I have learned from Sam, and we've also gone to various events and memorials and the Holocaust Museum here in the city, and so I do feel like I know a good bit, but the story is just, it's hearing it from that perspective makes it even tougher to get through. I think the reason it fell lower on the list for me is the ending felt very rushed. And I mean, it's a true story, like, written by somebody else who had talked to the man who the story is about. But the ending just kind of felt rushed, so I don't know what kind of caused that, or they just didn't want to go through all of the rest of it, and they were really focusing on this piece of it. But I wished the ending had been a little bit more drawn out about what happened afterwards. That's just why it wasn't 5 stars for me. But again, I think it's an important book that everybody does read. Okay, book number 7 is the first book of that series that I talked about. So let me go into a little bit more detail. The first book is called Matched. Again, futuristic, young adult, dystopian society, you know, Hunger Games, Divergent, etc. The overall premise is very similar to those, right? Where some overarching government took over and people are broken up into some sort of categories, and what happens when a young teenage girl doesn't want to be in that category anymore, right? But it's different. It's different than those, and I really enjoyed it. I really liked the main character, and I enjoyed the love triangle that there always is in these books, and I thought it was great. So I would recommend reading the first one. I would read the first one, and then if you enjoyed it and you feel like you want to read the second and third one, know that they're not as good. But are the second and third ones of these trilogies ever as good as the first one? Okay, the next book on my list is the sequel to The Tattooist of Auschwitz, kind of, and it's called Cilka's Journey, and it is about a woman who was in Auschwitz with the Tattooist of Auschwitz, but then actually ends up also going to serve in a Russian labor camp. Now, this book is partially nonfiction, partially fiction. Like, The Tattooist of Auschwitz is a true story that was parlayed by the main character, the guy the story's about. This one is about a real person, and pieces of it are true, but the author filled in a lot that wasn't true. And maybe that's why it ranks higher for me, because I enjoyed it more as a story standpoint, but I still also learned a lot about that time period and these Russian labor camps. But I just, the character, and maybe it's just because it's a female lead, I really, really enjoyed this book. I would still recommend reading both of them and starting with The Tattooist of Auschwitz, but know that I enjoyed this one more. Okay, book number 5 is kind of actually in that same family. It's an historical fiction called Between the Shades of Grey. And when I mentioned in a live or somewhere how much I enjoyed The Tattooist of Auschwitz and Cilka's Journey, somebody recommended this book, and then one of you so kindly sent it to me, bought it and sent it to me, because you know that I'm not buying books this year. And I I devoured that book. I took it with me to Texas and I loved it. I am not usually a historical fiction fan. That's also not usually the genre that I go to. History has just never been something that I am super into, but I really enjoyed this book. I enjoyed the characters. It is about a Lithuanian family that goes to a Soviet labor camp. It was great. It was a great book. And what I really also liked about it is it was written in very short chapters. So it was very easy to pick up randomly and read in little random spurts. Like I was out shopping with my stepmom and she needed to run into a store and return something. Well, rather than running in with her or just sitting in the car and playing on my phone, I pulled out my book and read one very short chapter by the time that she came back. So if you like books like that where you're struggling to read fiction because you don't feel like you have enough time to sit down and fully read long chapters, I think that this book is a great option because these chapters are so short that you can just read one for like 5 minutes short. And so you can find 5 minutes in the carpool lane while something's in the microwave, whatever, and devour it in little bitty pieces like that. It might be more realistic for you to get that reading in. All right, book number 4 was The Invisible Life of Addie Larue. And this was the most like recommended book of, I don't know, the year. Like it's like the hot book right now to read. And so Cindy did this one for her book club as well because she did one nonfiction and one fiction. And when she announced the book, she announced it early to her patrons in like January. I went to the library and I was like 300 and something in line to get this book. And so it took months. I did not get this book until the beginning of June. That's how long it took for this book to become available. But when I got it, I was like, I'm finally excited to read it. Now I will say it started out slow. That is why it is 4 stars instead of 5. It did start out slow, but once I was hooked and I could not put it down and finish it very, very quickly. And that is why I have it at number 4, because once I started it, I couldn't put it down and I really enjoyed the storyline. Fantasy is a genre that I really enjoy, but I loved the realism of this story too. Like it was fantasy, but it wasn't. And there were times that you would forget that you were reading a fantasy book. And that's what I really loved. It was also set in New York partially. And I loved that about it too. I just love things set in New York. And so I really like it. I know a lot of you have mentioned in the comments that you struggled to get through it at the beginning. Just try and push through because it does, eventually it hooked me. If it doesn't end up hooking you, not every book is for every person, but I really enjoyed it. Okay, 3, 2, 1. All great. I recommend all of these books. I think they're all fantastic. Y'all probably know what number 1 is because I've talked about it before, but let's go with number 3 is Followers. Again, futuristic society, young, I don't know if this one really is considered young adult. I guess they are. No, because one of them is in one time zone is not a young adult. So it's probably not considered young adult, but it is futuristic for sure. Also, again, partially set in New York City, and I was in it. I needed more. Like I want to know what happens next. Like I need more information than what I've gotten so far. It was that good. One of those other ones that once I started, I couldn't put it down. I don't even know how this book got recommended to me. I don't know how it ended up on my to read list, and then I put it on my hold list at the library, and then I had it in my hands and I loved it. So if you like futuristic dystopian, highly recommend Followers. It is, I didn't even really ever say what it was about. I mean, I felt like I could give the synopsis for all of these books, but you also can look that up, right? I'm giving you kind of my thoughts of it, and is what I say enough for you to go look up the summary, you can do that and then decide if you want to read it. I recently listened to a podcast, and I won't name names. If you listen to it, you probably know who I'm talking about, who recommended books in the podcast and literally like read the synopsis on the podcast. And I was like, nah, I don't know if I felt like that was necessary for that forum, but that's just me. Maybe you disagree and maybe you're like wishing I'd read the synopsis, but this one is about, hence the name Followers, is about somebody who goes social media viral, social media famous, and then when like social media kind of falls apart, what happens? I also feel like I struggled to give a synopsis without giving anything away. All right, book number 2 is Queenie, and I had owned this book for a long time. I bought a physical copy of this book a long time ago and just, I don't know, I never picked it up and read it. I wasn't as good about reading fiction last year. That's definitely true. So I finally picked it up. This is also one of the earlier books I read this year, and I could not put it down. This is a very current day and age book about a Black woman living in London, 20 something, going through like, you know, working a 9-to-5 job, her dating and love life, friends, family, and all the things that she goes through, both as a 20-something woman living in a major city, but also as a Black woman, and her experiences as a Black woman. I talked about this in a quarterly favorites video because this was definitely one of my favorite fiction books. Obviously it's number 2 on the list. But if you are like current day novels, highly recommend this one. And then the last one, which I've talked about in a number of places, is After I Do. And that is definitely my favorite fiction book I have read so far this year. It was recommended to me when I asked for books about marriage, and somebody recommended to this. And so for the longest time, I had it on my nonfiction book about marriage. And then when I transferred all of my to-read list from a notebook into Goodreads, I realized that it was fiction. And so I immediately put on hold at the library to read. I was like, oh, fun, a fiction book about marriage. Like, that sounds fun. Like, get me excited about planning a wedding. It is not about that piece of marriage. It picks up basically once the couple's already been married for a little while, but it doesn't mean that I still didn't relate to things that they went through and enjoy their storyline and all of just everything. I just really liked it. Again, another current day book about, it is a love story. I don't want to give anything away, but it is, you know, it's not a romance novel, but it is a love story. And I've heard a lot of you say that you love that author as well, and that you recommend her other books as well. I haven't read any of her other books yet, but they are on my list. All right, that is it. Those are all of the fiction books that I have read and which ones I recommend from the first half of the year. Let me know down in the comments what was your favorite fiction book if you read fiction from the first half of 2021. I would love to add it to my to-be-read list. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're new here, please click that subscribe button. I upload new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday focused on helping you achieve your goals. Thank you so much for watching. And I'll thank you so much for joining me on my squeaky chair. Red. That was awkward. Stars. That was a lot of rambling.